Okay, hello everybody. This is our Seven Stories class. We're going to just start with prayer, and then we'll get into the lesson. So I'd like to pray today that we have a good meeting, good class, uh, that it helps us to get closer to you uh, and grow in your word. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so. This is one of my favorite classes. I like all the Jesus classes, which are the third lesson of each cycle. This is the last lesson in the second story, which is violence to forgiveness. And this one is the prodigal son. In the last two classes, we've been studying Genesis, and we're going to continue with that today. How Jesus uses material from Genesis. So the first class, we looked at the prehistories, which set out the problem of the human condition, which was basically rivalry, desire that leads to exponential violence. And then the second class last week, we looked at the patriarchs, and the patriarchs run from chapter 12 through the end of Genesis. And they are the stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And we talked about how Genesis should be read as a whole, and that if the prehistory set out the problem of human violence, the stories of the patriarchs point to the solution, which is the forgiveness, the call into relationship with God, and that results in forgiveness uh, personified in the person of Joseph. And so last time we looked specifically at the stories of Abraham and Isaac, and then we skipped over Jacob and we went to Joseph to complete that arc. But now this week we're going to kind of backtrack and we're going to look at the story of Jacob, Jacob and Esau. Um, but before we do that, before we dive into that, I just want to ask uh, just in the New Testament refers to the book of Genesis in different places. And we were talking just before the recording started about Paul. And Paul does refer to Genesis, but he has a different focus than the way Jesus uses it. So just to start off quickly with that, we're going to read Romans 5. And while I read this, I want you to think about what is the primary concern? What is Paul concerned with when he's referencing Genesis? And what paradigm figure does he reference? You know, so I'm going to read 5:12 through 14 here. Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death came through sin, and so death spread to all because all have sinned. Sin was indeed in the world before the law, but sin is not reckoned when there is no law. Yet death exercised dominion from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sins were not like the transgression of Adam, who is a type of the one who was to come. Now, Paul is always slightly difficult to get your head around because he writes in a rabbinic style. So he kind of doesn't use the sentences go on and on and on. And it's sometimes a little hard to get into what's being said. But basically, if you're listening to that passage, well, what's the main concern? What's his concern? What's Paul's concern here? And who does he reference from Genesis? It's sin, that sin came into the world. So sin and death, um, that's the concern, how does Christ impact the main problem of human beings, which is sin that results in death? and he talks about Adam. Adam is the first, uh, the type of everyone who's to come, and because Adam sinned, we all are kind of caught up in that. So that's where he's coming from. But I just wanted to mention that because in the seven stories, Tony does make a point in that that quote is often mistranslated. So when it says, because all have sinned, um, Augustine came along, about 1,000 years ago, whatever, and he relied on the Latin translation of the Greek Bible. And so in quo means because, but the Latin translation became in whom. So in quo is usually should be translated as because, but it got translated as in whom. And the reason I'm stressing this, or the book stresses it, is that if you say, um, because of Adam, in whom all of us have sinned, rather than because uh, because all have sinned, it kind of flips the meaning into a sort of a legal sense. Like we are all linked to Adam's sin. So it's like Adam's sin is our sin, and it becomes like a legal thing that we can't get out of being tainted by it. And so it helps promote this sort of legal understanding of original sin. In fact, that's where it comes from, the original sin of Adam that we are all kind of linked to. But basically, it's the way we would read it is that Adam is just a figure that represents human beings. It's not like he was the ancestor, and this sin got passed down through our DNA, through all the generations we've inherited it. It's not to do with inheritance. It's to do with a description of, because we are all caught up in violence. That's the way we would understand Adam's sin. And if you read it in the original Greek, you can read it that way much more easily. Because all of us have sinned, because all of us are living in this, hardwired. The human paradigm is that we live in violence, desire, and all the things that we've been talking about. Because we are living in that sort of situation, that's the sense that we would understand. We're really focusing today on Jesus. And for Jesus, is a very different problem and a different paradigm figure that he turns to. So we're going to look, for example, in Luke 11. And maybe somebody else would read this. Luke 11, 49 to 51. Maybe Dixie?
Yeah, I'm still finding it. Okay, Luke 11,
okay.
I'd be happy to.
Luke 11, verse 49 through 51.
Okay. Okay, because of this, God in his wisdom said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill and others they will persecute. Therefore, this generation will be held responsible for the blood of all the prophets that has been shed since the beginning of the world, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, this generation will be held responsible for it all.
Yeah. So here, the issue that Jesus is focusing in on, and in all the passages where he uses Genesis, the issue is violence. And the person that he references from Genesis is not Adam, it's Abel, right? Abel, who was the first murder victim. So for Jesus, the heart of the matter, the core issue is violence. And he identifies murder as the original sin. And as we mentioned in the first lesson in the cycle, the first time sin is mentioned in the Bible is relating to the murder of Abel by Cain. And he says here that Jesus says here since the foundation of the world, and is that from the foundation of the world, the foundation is built upon the shedding of innocent blood, and which is covered up with lies. And actually, Girard's book, one of his first books, was called Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, and he's sort of referencing this verse from Luke here. So those, in his talking about there's one where he talks about your father is the father of lies, is a murderer from the beginning. But Jesus talks about you feel that you claim Abraham as your father, but he's talking to the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, and he says, but actually, your father is the father of lies. You know, you're is a murderer from the start, and because you're separating people, you're judging people. Okay, it's John 8:34-44. So Jesus answered them, very truly I tell you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not have a permanent place in the household. The son has a place there forever. So if the son makes you free, you will be free indeed. I know that you are descendants of Abraham, yet you look for an opportunity to kill me, because there is no place in you for my word. I declare what I have seen in the Father's presence. As for you, you should do what you have heard from the Father. They answered him, Abraham is our father. And Jesus said to them, if you were Abraham's children, you would be doing what Abraham did. But now you are trying to kill me, a man who has told you the truth that I heard from God. This is not what Abraham did. You are indeed doing what your father does. They said to him, we are not illegitimate children. We have one father, God himself. Jesus said to them, if God were your father, you would love me, for I come from God, and now I am here. I did not come on my own, but he sent me. Why do you not understand what I say? It is because you cannot accept my word. You are from your father, the devil, and you choose to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks according to his nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. And that's sort of where he goes on. Okay, so basically, you can see how Jesus is referencing the stories of the original murder, the original sin, and then the lie that covers it up. And that's a theme that we saw in the prehistory, is how civilization is built on the murder of Abel by Cain, is what the building of the civilizations emerges from that, and the human culture results from that. And Girard's thesis is that everything comes from the foundational scapegoating murder, and it's really it fits with the prehistories that we're kind of the way we control the violence in our societies is either by taboos or by scapegoating or by sacrifice. They're all sort of mechanisms, and they're all violent mechanisms that we put in place to try to control this exponential violence that's inherent in who we are. Another, just a side note, is that whenever you see the word Jews, like Jesus is, especially in John's gospel, that he's speaking out against the Jews. when we do our Bible study at Bethany, we tend to substitute the word Judean because Jesus obviously was a Jew, and all the people that were around him mostly were Jews. So we want to try to avoid the anti-Semitic language that can result from if you say Jesus spoke out against the Jews or the Jews were Jesus' enemy. So we put Judean because the Judeans were the people who lived in Judea, who was like the capital region. They were often the more privileged, the educated, the people in authority. They're sort of the Jewish authorities. And so, in fact, the Judeans were often disparaging of the people who lived in Galilee, which was up in the north of the country where Jesus came from. So we just tend to do that as a general practice, and you might find me doing that as we get into the gospel readings down the line. Anyway, that's another sidebar. But now we're getting to the heart of the matter, which is the story of Jacob. So in the stories of Jacob and Esau, it's the same themes that we've seen before of rivalry. So there's the rivalry that we see between Rachel and Leah, between Jacob and Esau, the two brothers. And there's also this object of desire, which in this story is the birthright, is the blessing and the birthright from the father. So we're going to read a couple of passages that set the story of Jacob before we look at how Jesus uses it. So we're going to look at Genesis 25, 22 to 25. Genesis 25, 22 to 25. And then we're going to skip forward to chapter 27 after that. So first of all, chapter 25, 22 to 25. And this is the beginning of the rivalry of the twin brothers. So starting at verse 22, the children struggled together within Rebekah. And she said, "If it is to be this way, why do I live?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples born of you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The elder shall serve the younger." And when her time to give birth was at hand, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red all his body like a hairy mantle, so they named him Esau. Afterwards, his brother came out with his hand gripping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. And that's the story at the beginning of the rivalry between the two brothers. And then we're going to skip forward to Genesis 27, 27 through 45. I'll just carry on reading it for the moment. 27, verse 27. So this is where Jacob, who's a bit of a trickster, is trying to steal his older brother's birthright. And his father Isaac is blind, and so he's trying to mislead his father so that he can trick him into giving him the birthright that belongs to his older brother. So Jacob came near and kissed him, and he smelled the smell of his garments and this is Isaac. So Isaac came near and kissed him, and he smelled the smell of his garments because he had covered himself in in Esau's smell, Esau's clothes, so that he would smell like Esau. And Isaac blessed him and said, "The smell of my son is like the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you." As soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, when Jacob had scarcely gone out from the presence of his father, Isaac, his brother Esau, came in from his hunting. He also prepared savory food and brought it to his father. And he said to his father, "Let my father sit up and eat his son's game, so that you may bless me." His father Isaac said to him, "Who are you?" He answered, "I am your firstborn son Esau." Then Isaac trembled violently and said, "Who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me, and I ate it all before you came? And I blessed him. Yes, and blessed he shall be." When Esau heard his father's words, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry, and said to his father, "Bless me also, father." But he said, "Your father came deceitfully, and he has taken away your blessing." Esau said, "It is not rightly named. Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and now look, he has taken away my blessing." Then he said, "Have you not removed a blessing? Have you not reserved a blessing for me?" Isaac answered Esau, "I have already made him your lord, and I have given him all his brothers as servants, and with grain and wine I have sustained him. What then can I do for you, my son?" Esau said to his father, "Have you only one blessing, father? Bless me also, father." And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. Then his father Isaac answered him, "See, away from the fatness of the earth shall your home be, and away from the dew of heaven on high. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But when you break loose, you shall break his yoke from your neck." So that's not such a nice blessing for Esau, but that's the setting of the scene of the rivalry between the two brothers. Now we're going to sort of skip forward. If you remember the story, Jacob at this point, he's afraid of his brother Esau, what Esau's going to do to him. So he flees and he kind of lives, he goes to the land out in the sort of deserts, and he meets with Laban, and falls in love with Rachel, Laban's daughter. He ends up marrying first Leah because he himself is kind of tricked by Laban, and has his 10 sons by Leah, and eventually then marries Rachel and has Joseph, and then Benjamin afterwards. So he's living, and he through other stories, his carries on his life as a trickster. He manages to take a lot of Laban's wealth as well. And in Genesis 31, there's his Laban's sons are resentful of Jacob because he's sort of taken over a lot of their flocks, and a lot of their wealth ends up in Jacob's hands. But Laban also begins to distrust him, so Jacob makes a decision to return to Canaan. And so we're going to pick up the story now in Genesis 32. And here is the story of Jacob arriving close by to where Isaac and his brother Esau are living in Canaan. He's coming back, and he's scared. He's rightfully scared because he's stolen everything from Esau, and Esau is now, a hunter, and lives by the sword, and he's a scary dude. And Jacob has to figure out what to do to appease his brother. And so this is what he comes up with. He's using his old ploys of trying to wheeling and dealing, basically. So we're going to pick up the story now at 32, 3 through 23. So Jacob sent messengers before him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, the country of Edom, instructing them, "Thus you shall say to my lord Esau, it's not Canaan. It's not Canaan. That's Moses. I'm getting ahead of myself. Sorry. They're not in Canaan. They're in Seir. Thus you shall say to my lord Esau, thus says your servant Jacob, I have lived with Laban as an alien and stayed until now. And I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male and female slaves. And I have sent to tell my lord, in order that I may find favor in your sight. The messengers returned to Jacob, saying, we came to your brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him. Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people that were with him, and the flocks, and the herds, and the camels, into 2 companies, thinking, if Esau comes to the one company and destroys it, then the company that is left will escape. And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham, and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, and I will do you good. I am not worthy at the least of all the steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I've become 2 companies. Deliver me, please, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I am afraid of him. He may come and kill us all, the mothers with the children. Yet you have said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted because of their number. So he spent that night there, and from what he had with him he took a present for his brother Esau, 200 female goats, 20 male goats, 200 ewes, 20 rams, 30 camels and their colts, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys, 10 male donkeys. These he delivered into the hands of his servants, every drove by itself, and said to his servants, pass on ahead of me and put a space between the droves. And he instructed the foremost, when Esau, my brother, meets you and asks you, to whom do these belong? Where are you going? And whose are these ahead of you? Then you shall say, they belong to your servant Jacob. They are a present sent to my lord Esau. And moreover, he is behind us. He likewise instructed the second and the third and all who followed the droves. You shall say the same thing to Esau when you meet him. And you shall say, moreover, your servant Jacob is behind us, for he thought I might appease him with the presents that go ahead of me. And afterwards I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me. So the present passed on ahead of him, and he himself spent that night in the camp alone. So he sent all his belongings, his wives and his children all ahead of him, and is alone at this place called Peniel. And now we're going to carry on the story here and see what happens next. So the same night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything he had. And Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, let me go, for the day is breaking. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then the man said, you shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved. And so that's the very famous story of Jacob wrestling with God as he's alone in fear of his life from his brother Esau. And now we're going to go forward to see what happens in chapter 33 when he meets Esau. So this is what happens. Now Jacob looked up and saw Esau coming towards him, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the two maids. He put the maids with their children in front, and then Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. He himself went on ahead of them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. When Esau looked up and saw the women and children, he said, "Who are these with you?" And Jacob said, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant." Then the maids drew near and their children and bowed down. Leah likewise and her children drew near and bowed down. And finally Joseph and Rachel drew near and bowed down. Esau said, "What do you mean by all of this company that I met?" And Jacob answered, "To find favor with my lord." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." Jacob said, "No, please, if I find favor with you, then accept my present from my hand, for truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God, since you have received me with such favor. Please accept my gift that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have everything I want." So he urged it, and Esau took it. So that's the story. So I want to now just imagine that scene. And also the face of God, the word face crops up in that narrative. In those chapter 32 and 33, I can't remember how many times, but the Hebrew word for face is all over the place in that narrative. And first of all, Jacob is wrestling with God. And he calls the place Peniel because Peniel means to see the face of God. Because if you remember from Exodus, you know, that scene where Moses went up the mountain, there's all that smoke and thunder. You could not look on the face of God and live. And yet Jacob sees the face of God and lives. And he's the first to really, you know, that his it doesn't really happen up to that point. So Jacob sees the face of God and he lives. And what happens when he sees Esau coming towards him, and Esau forgives him. And when Esau forgives him, Jacob says, "When I see your face, I see the face of God." When he looks at Esau, he sees the face of God because he understands for the first time that seeing Esau's forgiving face is actually seeing the face of God. It's like seeing the face of God. So there's this continuity between the forgiving nonviolent God and the forgiving nonviolent human being. Esau doesn't meet him with revenge, but instead he kisses him and weeps when he sees him. And it's through that act of forgiveness that Jacob understands something about the nature of God for the first time. So now, keep that story in your mind, and we're going to turn to the prodigal son. And when we hear the story of the prodigal son, I want you to think about the themes and the motifs that are present in the story of Jacob and Esau, and also the stories of Joseph and his brothers. And I'm going to try and share, instead of reading the story this time, we're going to watch it on Jesus of Nazareth version, if I can get my screen to work. So let's do this.
Rabbi, we want to hear your words.
Please, speak to us.
No, let's eat first.
No, let him decide.
Oh, let him speak. Oh, let us hear him speak. You never take me to hear.
No, let's eat first. Let's eat
No.
first.
No. I'd like to tell you a story.
Sit down, sit down.
Sit down.
A certain man had 2 sons. And one day the younger of these sons said to his father, "Give me my share of your estate now." So his father divided his wealth between his 2 sons. And a few days later, this younger son set off for a distant land. And there he squandered all the money he had on riotous living. Now, not long after this, a great famine swept over the land, and the boy began to starve. He persuaded a farmer to hire him to feed his pigs, but he was so hungry that even the husks he was feeding the swine began to look good to him. And still, nobody gave him anything. Finally, the boy came to his senses. At home, even my father's servants have enough food and to spare. And here I am starving to death. I will go home and ask my father to hire me as one of his servants. And so, he set off. Now he was still some distance from his home when his father saw him coming. And he was so filled with compassion that he ran towards his son and embraced him and kissed him. The boy said, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and you. I am not worthy to be called your son." But his father called for the servants and said, "Bring me the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Put rings on his hands and shoes on his feet. Kill the fatted calf. We must celebrate with a feast." My son was dead and is alive again. Now, the older brother, at this time, was working in the fields. And as he came back to the house, he heard the noise of music and dancing. He called for one of the servants and asked what was happening. And he was told. At this, the older brother became very angry, and he refused to go into the house. The father came out, tried to plead with him, but he wouldn't listen. "I have worked for you all this time, all these years, and never once have I disobeyed you. And in all that time, you've never even given me so much as a goat so that I could have a feast with my friends. My younger brother comes back, having spent all your money on harlots. And for him, you kill the fatted calf. Please," said the father. "Please, try to understand. You are always with me. Everything I have is yours. But it is right to celebrate. Your brother was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.
What are the themes that you can hear that are the same in the story of the two brothers in from Jesus and the Jacob story? I just shout them out. Anything that's the same. That seems like you know that Jesus has read about Jacob and Esau here. So why do you think that? Why would we think that? There's about several things. Anything,
About forgiveness.
right? Yep. The scene. It's exactly the same scene. He falls on his neck. In fact, in the language, the phrase used to hang on someone's neck is exactly the same wording in both stories. Um, uh, when Esau hugs Jacob and weeps, it's that same language is used, identical language. Anything else? Two sons, right? There's two sons and the father in both stories.
Well, they're love stories too. They show love and compassion towards each other.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's where they end up with. Both stories end up with compassion and forgiveness. Exactly. Well, the things that a reconciliation, yeah. Yep, that's right. Reconciliation, that comes from forgiveness. So this is what we came up with, similarities with the Jacob story. There's the younger son seizes the birthright. So when the prodigal son goes to his father and says, I want my share of my inheritance now, while you're still alive, that was a very offensive thing to do in that time, to demand I guess it still is, in some ways, but to demand your inheritance while the father is still living was very offensive. It's to do with his birthright, what would come to him, but is taking it illegally, not illegally, but he's not doing the right thing by demanding his inheritance. And of course, Jacob steals his birthright from his brother. They both of the youngest, they're both younger sons. The younger sons both end up leaving for a distant land. The character of Jacob and the prodigal son is very similar. They're both doing deals. They're both trying to figure how to survive, how to, work a deal in their favor. And as we say, the end scene is the clincher there, that scene of embracing and forgiveness. And in the story of the prodigal son, Jesus underlines the compassion by saying, actually stating that the father was filled with compassion. That is not in the Esau story, but he puts words to what's going on in God's heart the father's heart by actually saying that the father's heart was filled with compassion. And then there are similar themes also from the Joseph story. There's the lost dead son who comes alive again, is found. There's the elder brother's jealousy of the younger brother. There's a famine in the land that sort of makes you remember the Joseph story. And then Joseph, when Pharaoh puts on the best robe, the best coat, best robe, and puts a ring on Joseph's finger, it's the same motif that the father puts the best robe and so Joseph has the coat of many colors and the ring, Pharaoh's ring. The prodigal son, the father gives him the best robe and the ring on his finger. So in these ways, we know that Jesus was referencing those two stories. But the key difference is that instead of Esau, the person who forgives becomes the father. And the father figures in the Genesis stories, as we've mentioned before, they're flawed characters. They're not. It's often they instigate the rivalry. they're sort of implicit in setting up the problems. But with Jesus, Jesus makes the Father the pivotal figure. He is the compassionate, loving parent. So because he does that, and he makes the Father the person who forgives, and of course, all through his ministry, he refers to God as his Father. He shifts the focus from people, from human beings, and how we interact with each other, and how we should be interacting with each other. As in how Esau treats Jacob, but because he puts that forgiveness onto God, he shifts the focus from anthropology to theology. So it becomes the parable reveals not so much how we should be interacting with each other, although that's also true, but primarily he's teaching us about the nature of God, who God is. And then the parable continues, and we get this story of the older son now, the second half of the parable. So obviously and it came out very much in that video we watched, that it's talking about teaching people how to that if you live under the law, or you live according to the law but without compassion and mercy, you're missing the point, because you actually end up dividing and separating yourself from others. And so that obviously is a lot of what's going on with this part of the story. But the other part is to do with relationship with the Father, because when the Father says to the older son, everything I have, you're always with me, and everything I have is yours. What he's saying is that what's the most important thing, the most treasured thing, is that relationship, the relationship with the Father, being in the presence with the Father. That's the real blessing. So the older son is talking and complaining and he's describing himself actually like a slave. I worked for you like a slave. So he's not seeing the blessing in the relationship. In fact, he sort of perceives it as a burden, that he's having to do the right thing, to do the good and to be righteous. So there's no joy in that. And then the other thing that Jesus does so great and does so well in this parable is that the older brother talks to the father about this son of yours. But then the father replies, this brother of yours. So he again pulls the older son and reminds him about the relationship he has with his brother, and that forgiveness is the place where healing can begin. Does anyone have anything that they want to add on the story of the prodigal son? I mean, Jesus obviously talks about forgiveness in many places in the Gospels. I love how he uses the Jacob and Esau story. I mean, he was so familiar with Jacob, and I often wonder why God chose Jacob, because Jacob is such a nasty character, really. He has a cool name, Jake. I thought of calling it. If Susanna had been a boy, we were going to call her Jacob or Jake, but she was Susanna. So, however, I like the name Jake, but as a character, he's not a very prepossessing. Except after he's wrestled with God, he gets this insight about forgiveness. That's the new thing. And then that is brought into fullness in his son Joseph. Or Joseph actually lives out what Jacob begins to understand about God in that instance. But anyway, now we're going to look at another place where Jesus references forgiveness, and this is Mark 11. So look at that. So Mark 11, and this is setting the scene here. Jesus has just gone in and emptied the temple. He's driven out the sacrificial animals from the temple and brought to a halt, at least temporarily, the business, the sacrifices of the temple. And in verse 16, Mark 11:24. Okay, so he's just emptied the temple, stopped the sacrifices, and it's 11:24. And this is what he says. So I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it and it will be yours. Whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven may also forgive you your trespasses, your sins, or your violence. Okay? So what he replaces the sacrificial system of the temple with is prayer and forgiveness. That's what replaces the sacrifices in the temple. And he says, whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father can forgive you. No, I mean, the Father is always forgiving us. It's not like sudden. It's not like dependent on whether we forgive or not. We are forgiven. It's grace, right? There's nothing that we do to earn forgiveness. Like we don't earn it by forgiving somebody else. What's going on here is that if you practice forgiveness, just like Jacob and Esau, if you practice forgiveness, you see forgiveness in the face of God. You understand that God is forgiving, and therefore you feel forgiven. So once it's kind of like if you practice the forgiveness of God, you receive the forgiveness of God because you recognize it and you experience it. And so that's why we're called and Jesus says to us that we have to learn this discipline of forgiveness. And it's not something that's easy, it's not something that comes easy to us, but it's what we're called to do as disciples. We're called to pray, which means to be in relationship with God, and to forgive others so that we can deepen that relationship with God. Because if you are forgiven and you feel the grace and the love of God, you're going to be more likely to want to pray. If you feel condemned and judged and unforgiven, you're going to be alienated from God. You're not going to want to pray to God because God becomes a fearful God. So the lesson is that we are to practice forgiveness so that we can experience forgiveness ourselves and be drawn deeper and deeper into that relationship with that forgiving, loving God. So the last part of this lesson it's again, it's not central to the theme of forgiveness, although it does enter into this, but we put in a little bit about the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, because it's kind of an inversion of the story of the prodigal son. There's a lot of the same themes. It's only in Luke, like the prodigal son is only in Luke. This parable of the rich man and Lazarus is only found in Luke's gospel as well. And this is the one that's in Luke chapter 16. But you'll see a lot of the same themes, and we'll pick them up after we read the parable. Laura or Adrian, do you feel up to reading the story of the rich man and Lazarus, which is in chapter 16, verse 19 through to the end.
Don't have the same translation.
It doesn't matter. You can read it from your translation.
Okay, what verse?
19 through the end of the chapter 31.
There was a certain rich man. I don't know why I'm crying today. Which was clothed in purple and fine linen, and fared sumptuously every day. And there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, which was laid at his gate full of sores, and desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores, and it came to pass that the beggar died, and was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. And in hell he lift up his eyes, being in torment, and seeth Abraham far off, and Lazarus in his bosom. And he cried, and he said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus, that he may dip the tip of his finger in water, and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in his flame. But Abraham said, Son, remember that thou in thy lifetime receivest thy good things, and likewise Lazarus evil things. But now he is comforted, and thou art tormented. And beside all of this, between us and you, there is a great gulf fixed, so that they which would pass from hence to you cannot, neither can they pass to us that would come from thence. And then he said, I pray thee therefore, Father, that thou wouldest send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brethren, that he may testify unto them, lest they also come unto this place of torment. Abraham said unto him, They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. And he said, Nay, Father Abraham, but if one went unto them from the dead, they will repent. And he said unto him, If they hear not Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded through one rose from the dead.
Okay, so just just the similarities between the story of the prodigal son and this story is that you have this person, the prodigal son and Lazarus are both in desperate situations, begging for scraps. They're both in the company of unclean animals, of the pigs, the swine, and the dogs. There's a father figure in both stories. That's, the prodigal son's father, and then this one is Father Abraham. It was called Father Abraham rather than just Abraham. There's this distance a long way off, that the prodigal son goes to a far country, and then the father sees him from a long way off and runs to meet him. And here there's this distance between Lazarus and the rich man. There's this gulf, this chasm between them. There's the prodigal son and the rich man both squander. They live sumptuously and decadently. But there's different things going on in terms of the meaning, although there is some overlap. So sometimes this is translated just as a sort of Jesus talking to the people of his time about resurrection, because resurrection at that time wasn't something that everybody believed in. It was a relatively new idea or concept that was embraced by the Pharisees. It emerged in the scriptures in the book of Daniel, which is like a couple of 100 years before Jesus. So that's the first time resurrection is really mentioned in the scriptures. And the Pharisees and many people have begun to accept it and believe in it, the resurrection after the death. But some, like the Sadducees or the priests, chief priests, the people who were in the temple, rejected the idea of resurrection. because they felt it was a modern idea or something. I don't know why they rejected it, but they did. And at that time, when it mentions in that there were 5 brothers, that could be a reference to the 5 sons of the high priest. The priest, the rich man was wearing purple, which was the color that the priests would wear. And of course, Lazarus was the man that Jesus raised from the dead. So there is a lot of themes that do point to that kind of discussion that was going on at that time. However, the most obvious theme that's running through this is the divide between the rich and the poor, and that's what we're going to focus in on when we try to look at this parable. So there's this chasm, and it's interesting that Father Abraham says to the rich man, there's this chasm that's between us and you, that even if we wanted to come and reach out to you, we can't pass. We can't reach you. And the rich man is treating Lazarus even after death. He continues to treat him like a servant. He's saying, tell Lazarus to come here and give me some water. Even though he's in a desperate situation, he still wants Lazarus to come over and give him water. So he hasn't shifted his mindset at all, even though he's in hell. And so the chasm, the divide, is the divide that's set up between the rich and privileged and the poor, because they can't bridge it. They haven't bridged it. They haven't seen the poor as their brothers. They haven't learned compassion. And so it's not that God it's not this, because this parable is often used in medieval art, to depict hell, that you're burning in hell and you're thirsty and you can't even get a drop of water. And it's that sort of a horrible vision of hell. But Jesus is really not a medieval person. He's using this as a way to see how we create these divides between us. And unless you are willing to reach out in relationship, build, see the other person as your brother, as your sister, through forgiveness, through care of the poor, then that chasm is going to remain. And so if by forgiving, we see God is forgiving by nature and we can experience God's forgiveness, it's in the same way, if we build relationships with others and we work to overcome inequalities between peoples, then that's the world that we're going to live in. We're going to experience relationship. We're going to experience connection. And the world, the kingdom of God will be the world that we live in. And I often think again of and one of the Narnia books, this time the last Narnia book, The Last Battle. I think it's called The Last Battle. And there's this scene where the apes have been kind of these characters in the story all along. And that everybody ends up in this stable, in this barn stable. And when the Narnian, the heroes of the story, heroines of the story, go into the stable, which is a metaphor for them dying, they enter into the kingdom and they find themselves in Narnia, and they're in this beautiful space. And it describes Narnia in all these beautiful ways. But when the apes find themselves in the stable, they still find themselves, they feel like they're in the stable, and they're complaining about the mess on the floor and the horrible dirty straw. And the Narnians are going up to them and saying, no, look, can't you see there's this beautiful clean water and beautiful fruits that you can eat? And they're saying, why are you shoving this donkey shit in my face? And why are you trying to feed me dirty oats that you picked up from the ground? So it's like the world that you create is the world you're going to live in, basically. And I think that's the main meaning of this parable. So as I said, if you see forgiveness as a discipline, something that we're called to practice, even if you fake it till you make it, just keep practicing forgiveness, and little by little, you'll find yourself blessed by forgiveness. That forgiveness will become a blessing in your life, and it will be everywhere. You will forgive, and you will experience forgiveness, and you will be somebody that people will want to hang out with because you are accepting and forgiving and loving. So anyway, that is basically the end of the lesson for today. Some questions that I'll leave you with is, in what ways do I build chasms between myself and others? And have you had an experience of seeing the face of God in true forgiveness? Have you felt forgiveness through somebody, and in so doing seen the face of God? Has there been a time when the prodigal son comes to his senses? Has there been a time in your life when you felt you came to your senses and got out of a situation, or or changed a relationship, or changed a situation, and turned back to God? Even if it might not, you might not even talked in terms of God at that time, but you found you got out of a situation where you were spiraling down. And how did God act in that situation? What was the outcome? So those are some questions to meditate on this week. I also like this lesson because I feel like Esau, that when you're growing up as a kid and you read or you hear those stories of Jacob and Esau, Jacob's always the hero or whatever. But Esau is just sort of sidelined often. It's just the guy who is stupid because he got tricked. But actually, Esau is the one who's the true hero of the story, in a way. He's the one who teaches forgiveness to his brother. And so I like it. I like this story because it reinstates Esau as part of God's program of showing us how to be human in a different kind of a way through reconciliation, forgiveness. Go ahead, Maggie.
I know I wasn't here through the whole section today, but from my memory of also taking it with Tony, was the reason why this section was so meaningful to me is forgiving, like 9/11. I knew somebody the first week. I didn't know somebody was in the tower. The second week I found out a very good friend of ours was in the tower. That in trying to find forgiveness was difficult. And Tony mentioned radical forgiveness. And I think that's what Jesus is asking of us in trying to actually demonstrate to us. Because once we can embrace the forgiveness and build our compassion, it's easier to go out and fight or work. I want to say work, I don't want to use violent words, but to work for justice, help others find justice. And I think forgiveness and compassion are the ways to do that. And through, we don't know what our times are going to be like in our future in these next few years. And I think we're going to need a lot of forgiveness and compassion and understanding other people's predicaments or situations, so that we can find, because forgiveness and compassion leads to love. And I think Jesus was trying to do that, especially in the prodigal son. think outside the box. The father thought outside the box, didn't stay with the norm of what his group might be doing and how other people did it. He took the risk and stepped out of the box and forgave his son and welcomed him home. And I think these are all really good lessons, especially for today's time and place of what's happening in our world.
Yeah. And I think at the heart of forgiveness, I mean, when we use it, is compassion, and compassion means that it's like empathy.
Mhm.
You actually see the person, you really see the person as a beloved human being, as your brother, as your sister.
Because we
So,
don't know their stories or where they came from.
no, we can't judge anyone because nobody has walked in the shoes of anyone else.
Right.
We don't know their upbringing. We don't know their traumas, their joys, their relationships, their fractured relationships. We don't know what's brought them, what life experiences have brought them to that point. And there, but for the grace of God, would be you or me, if maybe they've experienced terrible things.
And God
And
loves
so
all people and all creatures.
God has mercy on everybody, because God has walked with them through their story. We're very quick to judge and to compare people with ourselves. And so I think that the first step towards forgiveness is always humanizing your enemy, like seeing them as a human being with all the stuff that all human beings share. And all human beings have these same concerns. There's food, relationships, children, work, health, aging, all these things are common to all of us. And so if you can connect with that person as a human being and have compassion on their story, that's the way to forgive, I think. And forgiveness is, like I say, a discipline. It's not something that you just choose. You do choose to do it, but it's not something that just happens once and done. It's a discipline. It's a discipline. It's something you have to teach yourself. And it's like any other discipline that you do. Think of something that is a discipline for you that you have to do, like learning something every day, every week, every month. You keep doing it, every day. That's a discipline. And forgiveness is something that you have to practice really to get good at it. It's not something that's just going to fall out of the sky. It has to be a life choice, and something that you take on. But then once you do it, you enter into you see the face of God. I mean, how wonderful is that? You become a child of God. You become a child of the Father. You experience the Father's relationship. And then the Beatitudes, if blessed are those who are merciful, they will receive mercy. You become, all those Beatitudes that we studied before, pure in heart, your heart is empty of violence. You see God. If you empty your heart of violence, you see the face of God. So, okay. Well, next time around, I apologize again for today. It was really messy. But next time, hopefully, we'll start afresh. We're a third of the way through the course. Next week, we're studying the first of what we call the two shell stories. So there are 5 stories that are from something to something, like from violence to forgiveness, from oppression to justice. That was the first story. But there are 2 other stories that are focused on what we call the shells. And these shells are things that all human beings throughout history have always put in place or given importance to. One is land and nationality, a sense of belonging to a nation or a specific group or a land. And so we're going to look at the land. And then down the line, the sixth cycle is the temple. It's the other big one that human beings have always found their security in. So the next cycle is looking at the land and how important the land is and was to the Jewish people. And then the second in the lesson is how they responded to the loss of the land, because they lost the land and with the exile and then with the Romans, at the time of Jesus, they hadn't got control of the land like they had under David. And then the third lesson is what Jesus says about the land. So that's a very important cycle to look at too. So that's what we're going to be looking at next.